Hey everybody, my name is Sean Fogarty and wanted to start doing a video series in regards with mold, some of the things that we run into, we discuss. I'm going to start off with a simple one, mold basics. If you know anything about mold, this one might bore you, but hopefully it'll have some good information. Let's see. So, real quick, my info: state of Florida licensed home inspector, mold assessor, residential contractor, and I run a full service inspection company with several employees, covering all aspects of residential and commercial property assessments. So, does my home have mold? And the simple answer is yes. All homes have mold in them, regardless of age. In most cases, the older the home, the more mold may be present to a certain extent, but we'll get into that. Mold breakdown. There are three general classes of molds. You've got your allergenic molds, which are typically the molds you'll find most prominently outside or floating around in the air. They're the ones when you watch the weather in the morning or the news, and the weatherman says, the pollen count is this number today, and the mold count is this. Well, that's what they're kind of referring to. Next, we have pathogenic molds, which again create pathogenic effects, and then we have toxinogenic molds. It's a mouthful, isn't it? Or toxic molds, things like Stachybotrys, which everybody's heard of, Memnonia, Ketonium. These molds are typically found in homes because you've had an issue, a water event, a flood, whatever. They shouldn't be there. Other than a random mold spore floating in on a rare occasion, you should have concentrated molds found of these type of toxic producers. And then something else I want to emphasize is black mold. It's an inaccurate coin phrase. Just because it's the color black doesn't mean it's toxic. So there are black allergenic molds. I've seen all kinds of colors: grays, browns, yellows, orange. So I don't know why people coin the phrase black mold. And of course, a lot of people use that as just a really bad terminology. Color has nothing to do with it. We're focused on molds that can harm you, toxic effects, pathogenic effects. So that's what we're focused on. So try not to use black mold as a coin phrase. All right. How does mold get into the building? So primarily, it enters via air transfer. That can be something as simply as opening your door, having your windows open and the breeze is blowing through, or what we call stack effect, where air exchanges or transfers, circulation, that type of thing through buildings. And of course, the older the structure, the more gaps and cracks and crevices and less airtight that structure is, the more it's going to exchange air. We also have humid conditions. A good example of humid conditions would be, the retired couple that has a condo on the beach. They go back to Michigan for the summer, and they don't set their thermostat low enough to dehumidify their space. There's already molds existing in the air, but because they don't have moisture content to allow them to thrive, they're not of any concern or harm to people. But when the elevation of the humidity gets higher and reaches threshold conditions, well, then that gives that mold a chance to start growing. And then you walk into the condo and there's gray fuzz or yellow fuzz growing on everything. It's growing on cabinet doors, on bedspreads, on all their knickknacks. I've seen some pretty significant messes. And then lastly, moisture entry due to failure of a system or the building itself. So that would be roof leaks, water leaks, HVAC, air returns leaking, that type of thing. And then I also made a note here: VOC producing molds will off gas, and these will also create health effects or issues. Dormant or dead molds won't do this. So when we talk about VOCs, volatile organic compounds, these are a type of off-gassing the molds create, which is just as harmful, if not more harmful in some cases, to you at a health standpoint. Where VOCs become a problem is when you have like a wet wall and you've got the Stachybotrys or the Memnonia growing on the wall, and it's producing this off-gassing, and it's getting into the bedroom that your kids sleep in the basement, and starting to create health problems. So when I emphasize dormant or dead molds, Um, if the mold's dead, mold spore's dead or dormant, what we call dormant, where it's not thriving or alive, uh, it's not going to be producing VOCs or off gassing. So it's not necessarily an issue if the mold spore itself can't get to you. All right, signs of mold. Everybody knows what signs of molds are typically. You can see it growing on the building materials from water leaks, visible growth on interior surfaces due to humid conditions, which I just talked about in the condo example, and then musty odors inside the building or the home. So again, musty odors are the house trying to tell you something. You've got an issue, and those are the off gassing that the mold's doing, what you smell with mustiness. All right, when is it harmful? Regardless of classification, excess amounts of molds can create health concerns for everyone. And of course, heavy exposure to allergenic molds can cause harm, and minimum levels of toxic molds can cause harm as well. So, most people to some extent can handle a lot of the allergy molds. Other than creating allergy symptoms, they're not going to make you deathly sick or ill or kill you. But some of these molds, with extended or prolonged exposure and high levels, can definitely create a lot of health concerns. And then, of course, VOCs from molds penetrating interior spaces. And dead or dormant mold spores trapped in cavities, the attic, or other excluded areas are of no risk to you. So go over that one real quick. We talk about when is mold harmful. Obviously, you don't want to be breathing in mold spores, but a lot of homes or a lot of buildings have what we consider, closed cavities, wall spaces, the attic space typically, or excluded areas. These areas are not part of your indoor air quality. So if they're not part of your indoor air quality and these mold spores aren't getting in your indoor airspace, then they should have no risk to you at a health standpoint if they're not active, alive, and sporulating or off gassing, etc. And I will get into this particular video on another day to emphasize it more in detail. But the attic's a great example of how attics are going to ventilate. They're going to do convection ventilation. Cooler air rises from the soffits, comes out of the ridge vent, and as air wafts through the attic, mold spores are going to be in the attic too. So the dustier the attic or the dustier the space, because dust and mold have a loving relationship, you're going to have more mold or elevated mold spores. And insulation is a great insulator. It's a great filter. It traps these mold spores that just float randomly in the air. And then over a few decades, things collect. So that's kind of why we emphasize, unless there's some strange occurrence where it's pulling air from these spaces, it shouldn't be. These dead spaces aren't really of risk to you if there's not active mold growing in them. How much is too much? So it's not possible to quantify molds because every person reacts differently, and that's true. They don't have magic numbers saying you can only have 20,000 spore count of aspergillus inside of your home. It's because everybody doesn't react the same way. You could have 99 people that won't be harmed by a specific penicillin mold, and that one person could just be deathly allergic to them. So, but the average threshold, the rule of thumb number a lot of people seem to go by, is 1,000 to 1,500, spore count floating around in the air at any given time for indoor air quality. And this is based on an air sample. And again, dead or alive, your body can react to contact with mold spores. It doesn't really know the difference. Why most allergy molds pose little risk with normal exposure. A few people can become ill or die, and any mold with a toxic or pathogenic classification should not be present at all. Let me say that again. Any type of toxic or pathogenic mold shouldn't be in your home. If it is, it's there for a reason. So, and then of course, keep in mind over 100,000 different types of molds. We primarily focus on the ones commonly found in homes or buildings. There are a lot of the ones that just we typically find in your house. Why indoor spaces matter? Accumulated molds will always be present in non-livable spaces, which we kind of hit on that a little bit talking about the attic. They're always going to be there. If you're going to circulate air through your house, it's going to breathe, it's going to collect dust, it's going to exchange air, and it's going to bring mold spores in with them. Doesn't mean your house is contaminated. It's just part of the deal. Molds accumulate in wall cavities, attics, crawl spaces, etc., and are not part of the indoor air quality unless conditions exist that can draw them in. So when we talk about that, crawl spaces are great examples. You can have a really clean house, but the crawl space is nasty, infested with moisture, mold, fungus, etc. And if you create a situation where you call stack effect, or you draw that air up through all the vents and the nooks and the crannies from the crawl space, it's going to bring that contaminated air into your space. The presence of mold spores in these areas pose no health risk to you unless they are active, because they're not part of the indoor air. And again, I hit on that already. Dead spaces, spaces behind walls, baseboards, whatever, they're trapped, they're not active, they pose no risk to the indoor air. They're not a part of your indoor air, so they pose no risk to you unless you create a condition in your home where it's drawing these molds in. A little diagram here, examples of air transfer, several different ways: wind effect, stack effect, combustion ventilation effect. You got the winds blowing at 80 miles an hour and you live in a home that was built in 1930, you're going to have some air moving through it. Stack effects is just that hot air rises. So cooler air gets sucked in and escapes through building materials and out the roof. And combustion and ventilation effect is, you're running bathroom fans, kitchen range hood, you're burning a fireplace in the wintertime. These things need oxygen. These fireplaces need oxygen. If your house was airtight, your fireplace wouldn't work, or bad things would happen. So you got to have that air moving through the hall. All right, doing this lovely picture of this beautiful blue bathroom. By all accounts, it's probably from the 50s, from what I remember. And it's just a good example of, we talk about demoing bathrooms or demoing spaces to redo things, uncovering old damage. When you do remodels, you can uncover old damage trapped behind walls. So mold that's dry and concealed poses little health risk since it's not part of the indoor air space. And then once mold has been uncovered, now it can enter the indoor air space. And I've seen this many times. You're dealing with old houses, a lot of old beachside houses. The yards are flat as a pancake. We've had plenty of hurricanes over the years. Water will fill up in the yards, not drain off as fast. There's a good chance you might have had a little bit of water creep in kind of at that ground level and get some of the old materials at floor level wet 3 decades ago. Well, they'll go in and take their baseboards off and, oh God, I got mold behind my baseboard. Or you'll go to remodel a bathroom that's 60 years old and you're surprised that there's mold behind it because you've had water leaks in the past. Well, that happens. That's part of it. If the mold isn't active, if it's not being fed water and a food source, if it's not thriving, it's just trapped mold spores. It's no different than the mold that floats in and gets trapped in behind walls and cavities and spaces. It's not until you go to demo the bathroom, or you go remodeling and taking baseboards off, or pulling up old floors or whatever. Now these spores that have been accumulated and trapped are now part of your indoor air quality or space. So, and I'll focus on that on a different video too, but this is why we emphasize, concealment or encapsulated areas so you're not spreading this stuff around. Quick example is we did some apartments one time that flooded years ago. And of course, we came in, they wanted us to do mold testing after they had removed the lower half of the walls to try to dry them up. Well, not only were we uncovering the mold that had grown from the several days of having wet walls in some of these units, but the bigger problem is you've opened up a wall from a place that was built in the 70s. So now all these mold spores and the dust that have accumulated in these cavities and spaces that wasn't part of our indoor air quality, or between levels where you've got a bathroom upstairs and you've got the ceiling below, you uncover these spaces and now it's taken decades worth of dust and mold accumulation, and they put blower fans to blow up and through these walls and cavities to help dry these walls out. Well, now they just basically smacked a hornet's nest. They spread more mold. We pulled air samples in these places, and the numbers were just astronomically ridiculous because they recontaminated everything. It's just they made a huge mess. So that was a fun one to try to remediate and clean up, but different story for a different day. It's just a great example to use on how you have that old dust and accumulation. You can create bigger issues by uncovering, walls or opening spaces up. Of course, the older the home, the more dust, age, lack of modern building practices allows for mold accumulation, allows for dust accumulation. Many older homes have the ability to ventilate, therefore, any moisture that gets in can evaporate due to lack of sealants, tight building practices, insulation materials. Again, I emphasize, we talk about the house built in 1890 that's all wood windows, wood sashes, wood framing, wood siding. There's gaps around windows, water creeps in places, gets in the walls, but there's no insulation in the walls. It leaks down into your basement where you've got an old oil burning furnace or an old octopus furnace that you're heating the home with, especially the old homes. They're heating them with coal. These big furnaces, it was probably 120 degrees in some of these basements as the heat rises from, just normal convection to heat this old home. And even if stuff was getting wet, it was drying out in a short amount of time because there was nothing to hinder that ability for the air transfer and the heat to dry things out when the walls got wet. But with modern building practices, your insulation, your tight building materials, your paper on your drywall, and when these walls get wet, the moisture's got nowhere to go. It gets trapped, so the mold just thrives in these places. And I think what they coined the phrase sick building syndrome. It's something we haven't, you didn't hear about in the 50s or 60s, but as the 70s and 80s evolved, they started using the term sick building syndrome, which I think a lot of it evolved simply from the fact that they started making tighter houses and they started creating additional problems. So, ensuring you have a mold-free home built in 1954 just simply isn't possible. Guess what? If it's full of mold, there's no way to fix it. So when I say this, I'm not saying it's full of toxic or black mold or mold that's going to give you brain bleeds and seizures. But the normal everyday allergenic molds that are floating around in the air, they can accumulate in these old structures. So to expect a house to be mold free is just not possible. And that was what I'm trying to emphasize here. It's that's the stuff. So what molds are relevant? Age construction has reached relevant equilibrium, which means the meaning is mold accumulation and air transfer has balanced out to an expected level for that particular decade or age of the home. Things have kind of found a happy balance there. And of course, this doesn't exist in new construction because the home isn't even a year old. It hasn't had the time to accumulate. So we've been tasked to do some general mold testing or air sampling of new construction homes. And in some ways, it's kind of a moot point because what are we testing? It's a brand new house unless you have something specific that got damaged. If a good example, people say, "Oh, I saw this stuff, it got wet," and they put it in the house anyway, and then they covered it up. Okay, well, here's the problem: it's covered up, it's now dry. You can have mold growing on mold covering a wood stud in your bathroom closet or your bedroom closet, and they covered it up with drywall. Well, if the building materials aren't wet and that stuff has been concealed or covered up, we're not going to find it. Relevant molds are the ones built up inside your home from leaks, water damage, excess filth, etc. Also, VOC production through building materials. And again, air leaks from natural drafts, including stack effect that could draw contaminated mold from your crawl space into your living space. I kind of hinted on that or talked about that briefly. We talk about the dead mold or the trap mold. It's not going to hurt you. It's not harmful. It can become an issue if we create a stack effect or an ability to draft or draw the air from these trap spaces into your indoor air quality space. Then you start pulling mold. And then, of course, lastly, contaminated HVAC units or units in contaminated spaces. And a good example of that is you've got this, again, really kind of grimy crawl space with mold in it. Your air handler's down there, and some type of animal or critter gets in and tears holes in your ductwork. Your AC unit kicks on, and your return duct is torn open from a raccoon or a cat, and it's sucking all this old nasty air out of the crawl space and just distributing it throughout the rest of the home. Well, that's how you can contaminate an indoor living space when you don't have mold inside your home to begin with. Of course, proper evaluation, if you do have a concern or an issue, proper mold assessment should start with a visible inspection of the home. And again, it should start with a visible inspection of the home. It should not start with air samples. And I'll get into that when I finish this slide. So the assessment is intended to find actual problems and recommendations for improving potential risk areas. Air samples can be taken in conjunction or with, but shouldn't be taken by themselves. And high mold counts don't tell you where the problem is on air samples. And that's just it. I've had people go, can you come do a mold test? And they want you to take air samples. Well, air samples don't tell you anything other than what's the air quality the day I was there. And the air quality can change by the hour, by the day, by the season, by the winds and the storms and the rain that we're having, and blah, 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 on and on and on. So air sampling is a snapshot in time, and air sampling is supposed to be used simply to verify what's floating around in your indoor air quality at the time. So I'm not saying we don't do it. We've done it plenty of times for people, but if you take an air sample and something shows up, well, then you're going, okay, well, you've got high levels of this type of mold. Now what? Well, now we have to go back and do what we should have done to begin with. We have to do a visible mold inspection to find where the problem's coming from. So, all right. And lastly, avoid scammers and the untrained. And I'll get more into depth in another day. Florida law prohibits assessors also to remediate. It's against the law to try to sell somebody a remediation job if you came in and did free mold testing. Avoid people that are going to do free mold testing for you because they're looking to sell you a job. Improper testing techniques to generate false claims and scare clients. Individuals that damage or remove building materials in homes without the owner's permission. I've been in real estate transactions where I've seen clowns come in and start tearing stuff apart in homes. It's not your house. You can't destroy it. You have to have the homeowner's permission. Using the wrong tools and equipment, generating false claims. I can make any air sample fail if I wanted to. One way to make an air sample fail is to take an air sample inside like a commercial building, a school, an doctor's office. You got these ceiling tiles up top. What you do is reach up there and start fluffing ceiling tiles. Guess what happens? It takes all that old nasty, dusty air from above the ceiling tiles and it starts pushing it into the room that you're testing with the air sample. Guess what? Guess what that air? Don't ask me how I know. But guess what that air sample comes back as? It comes back as elevated readings, and you've got a mold problem. So avoid these people. Try to find people that generally want to come in, do the job right, and not try to sell you a remediation job based on what they claim they found inside of your home. Of course, any further questions, here's our info. You can give us a call, email us, go to our website, fogartyinspectionservices.com. And I appreciate your time.